Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We will now begin story 1. The sleeping quarters of medieval nobility. You find yourself standing in a dim corridor, your breath visible in the still air, a long draught winding through the cracks in thick walls. It is winter. The torches flicker but offer no real warmth. Before you is a large wooden door bound in iron. It creaks open slowly, revealing the bedchamber of a medieval noble. There is no fireplace. Contrary to romantic images, most medieval bedrooms, even among the nobility, were not the cozy havens depicted in modern fantasy. They were, more often than not, dark, chilly, and austere. The great stone walls of a castle were efficient at keeping out attackers, but they were equally good at keeping out the sun and warmth. These rooms were sanctuaries not from the weather, but from people. To understand how anyone slept in such an environment, one must begin with the room itself. A noble's bedchamber was often situated in a tower or upper floor of the keep, the strongest and most secure part of the castle. These rooms were built for protection, not comfort. Windows, if present, were narrow slits. Glass was expensive, rare, and fragile. Most windows were covered with oiled parchment or wooden shutters, which blocked out wind but also most light and air. Inside, the stone floor might be covered with rushes, a mixture of herbs, straw, and other natural debris scattered to soak up spills and mask odors. The smell of dried lavender, mint, or rosemary might have provided a faint sweetness, though it would have mixed with the odors of damp stone, soot, and unwashed linen. Rugs were rare luxuries, used sparingly and only by the wealthy, often imported and expensive. Even then, the dampness of the room crept into every fiber. The bed was not just a piece of furniture, it was a symbol of power and privacy. The wealthiest nobles had large, four-poster beds with curtains drawn around them, curtains not for luxury, but for insulation. These drapes trapped the sleeper's body heat, protecting against the night chill. In many cases, the beds were shared not just by couples, but by servants or companions. Body heat, like fire, was a resource not to be wasted. Underneath the embroidered coverlets, wool, velvet, or even fur, there would be multiple layers of bedding. A linen sheet, wool blankets, perhaps even a bearskin in the coldest months. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, wool, or feathers depending on status and local resources. Some had ropes strung beneath them, which needed tightening regularly. It is from this system that the phrase "sleep tight" is often believed to have emerged, though the origins are debated. But warmth didn't always come from the bed itself. In noble households, bed warmers were a common feature. Brass pans filled with hot coals from the kitchen fire passed between the sheets before the sleeper entered. This task was usually done by a servant carefully, so as not to start a fire, a real danger in a room filled with dry fabrics, wooden beams, and flammable wall tapestries. Speaking of tapestries, they too were not purely decorative. Large woven wall hangings served as insulation, breaking the contact between cold stone and living space. They helped contain heat and also blocked drafts, which could sneak through even the tightest masonry. These hangings depicted scenes of nobility, battles, saints, or moral tales, offering something to gaze upon as one drifted into sleep. And yet, despite all of this, curtains, bed warmers, tapestries, the room remained cold. You would feel the chill in your bones if you rose during the night. The candles, if still burning, would cast long shadows. If a fire had been allowed in the room, and not all rooms had fireplaces, you would still wake up to a bedchamber where your breath hung in the air, and the embers glowed faintly in the hearth. There were night clothes, but they weren't standardized. A noble might sleep in a long linen shift, or simply in their underclothes. In some regions and periods, sleeping naked was common. In others, a full gown or robe was preferred, particularly in colder climates. Head coverings were worn by both men and women, nightcaps or hoods to retain heat, since a surprising amount of body heat escapes from the head. But perhaps the greatest contributor to warmth was routine. The medieval nobles structured their evenings carefully: early suppers, minimal bathing, limited movement after dark. Heavy meals taken near the hearth were intended to warm the body before bed. People huddled near the fire as long as possible, often wrapping themselves in cloaks or blankets. Physical activity was minimized as the night wore on. The mind and body prepared for stillness, for the kind of slow surrender that sleep requires. What about the silence? Despite our assumptions, medieval castles were rarely quiet. Even in bedchambers, the sounds of life crept in. The clatter of servants in the kitchens below, the barking of hounds in the courtyard, the wind howling through cracks in the stone, and the ever-present creak of timber in cold weather. If you shared your room or your bed with another, you would hear their every movement. Privacy was a luxury. Soundproofing, as we understand it, did not exist. And yet people slept. They adapted to the conditions. They knew nothing different. The architecture, the bedding, the rituals all were tools to survive the long, dark hours of a medieval winter. Every element of the bedchamber, from its layout to its linens, was a response to one central problem: how to stay warm enough to live through the night. But not everyone in the castle had a room like this. The noble's bedchamber was the best one available, and still it was cold, shared, and full of discomfort. One might begin to wonder, if this was the upper-class experience, where did the others sleep? How did the staff stay warm if they had no draped bed, no tapestries, no fireplace of their own? And what about the children? You've seen the noble's chamber. You felt the chill in the stone, the faint warmth of a dying fire, and the eerie quiet interrupted only by the creaking of timber or the rustle of a bed curtain. But that room, sparse and uncomfortable as it was, represented the best conditions a medieval castle had to offer. Now, you must descend. Down winding steps, through narrow hallways below the great hall and kitchen hearths, to where the real warmth or lack of it defined the medieval experience of sleep. The servants' lot, shared spaces and stolen heat. Servants were the spine of a medieval household. From kitchen hands to personal attendants, their work filled every hour of the day. And when that work was done or paused, they had to find sleep where they could. There were no private rooms, no carved beds or warmed brass pans for them. Most castle servants slept in communal areas, on benches, under staircases, near the pantry, or if they were lucky in the lofts above the kitchens where the day's heat lingered a few hours longer. Sleeping arrangements were dictated by hierarchy even among the staff. The more trusted servants, such as a noblewoman's maid or a lord's personal valet, might sleep on a pallet within the lord's chamber, on the floor, or a narrow bench. This was practical. They were expected to be ready at a moment's notice, and it also provided a bit of residual warmth from the master's fire. Others weren't so fortunate. Lesser staff might sleep in rooms that were little more than stone storage chambers. Some slept near livestock not only because space was scarce, but also because animals emitted heat. A stable hand might curl up in straw beside the horses. It wasn't luxury, but it was warmer than stone. Pallets were basic. Straw mattresses in wooden frames, shared blankets, if any, and rarely more than one layer of linen. Most servants slept in the clothes they worked in, as removing garments at night invited cold. They curled into balls, wrapped in cloaks or furs if available. Many households rationed woolen blankets strictly, prioritizing the main family. There were no alarms, of course. Dawn was announced by roosters, the toll of a bell, or the soft thud of a master's boot calling for assistance. Sleep was not always a long, uninterrupted stretch. It was often fragmented, influenced by the rhythm of chores and expectations. But despite the cold, despite the discomfort, the servants endured. Survival bred endurance, and in a world where sleep was a necessity, not a luxury, even a patch of straw beside the hearth was a blessing. Sleeping children, warmth through closeness. In noble families, children were often raised within the household until a certain age, after which they might be sent to other noble homes for fostering. Before this separation, children were part of the household's sleeping rhythm. Infants, unsurprisingly, stayed with their mothers or nursemaids. Cradles lined with fur, and blankets were kept close to the fire or beneath the protective curtains of the great bed. Wet nurses and maids slept nearby, sometimes even sharing the bed to respond quickly during the night. But even for the young, survival was not guaranteed. Cold, illness, and poor sanitation posed risks in every castle. Older children too big for cradles but too young for their own roles often shared beds with siblings or other children. It was not uncommon to find multiple children sleeping head to foot in the same mattress, limbs tangled, breath mingling in the frosty air. They learned early to share warmth, to conserve body heat instinctively. In the colder seasons, their sleep schedules matched the rising and setting of the sun. Once dusk arrived and the main hall fire was reduced to embers, they were ushered upstairs or into side chambers for the night. Candles were precious and rarely burned for long. Sleep arrived early not because of choice, but because there was little else to do in the dark. Sometimes, children were comforted by lullabies or religious prayers, whispered by maids or mothers, repeating the same refrains night after night. The tone was soft, barely audible, accompanied by the creaking of floorboards and the distant bark of dogs in the yard. Cold toes, chilled breath, but the rhythm of words and the safety of proximity, these were the comforts of medieval childhood sleep. And when sickness came, as it often did, warmth became a matter of life or death. Sick children were moved closer to fires, wrapped in extra cloths, monitored by candlelight. Herbal remedies, warm broths, and layers of wool were offered as protection. Still, fevers, chills, and the many ailments of the Middle Ages claimed many young lives before they could fully grow. The hearth at the center of life. If there was one location in the castle that truly held heat, it was the kitchen. More than just a place for cooking, the kitchen hearth was the lifeblood of warmth for the entire household, and it was often where warmth seekers congregated in secret. Once the day's cooking was done, servants, kitchen boys, even guards on rest would sneak into the kitchen to rest near the fatting fire. Not every lord tolerated this, but many turned a blind eye. Sleep, however brief, in the lingering warmth of the oven was more healing than hours spent in a cold chamber. Sometimes, a small fire might be lit in a portable brazier and moved to another part of the castle. But fire was always a risk. Whole structures had been lost to sparks catching on tapestries or thatched roofing. Fires were carefully monitored, extinguished before midnight in many cases, leaving the castle to endure the cold unassisted until morning. And in some more sophisticated or southern regions, the hypocaust, a Roman innovation of underfloor heating, was adapted in parts of monastic or noble dwellings. These were rare, expensive, and delicate to maintain. Still, for a select few, warmth could come from below. For the rest, survival meant adapting to cold nights with clever routines and hardened expectations. Night watch and the echo of footsteps. A castle never truly slept. Guards walked the perimeter, patrolling the walls, stamping their feet to stay awake and warm. Torches flickered in towers. Watchmen rang bells at hourly intervals, marking time like a slow, cold metronome. Sometimes nobles awoke to those bells. Other times they were woken by dreams, or the howling wind, or the needs of their restless bodies. Indoor chamber pots were standard, though unpleasant, and were often emptied by morning. For servants, this too became part of their nocturnal routine. Yet despite all this nocturnal activity, the night was still ruled by silence. The kind of silence that settles into thick walls and narrow halls. A silence broken only by shifting bodies, crackling embers, or the scurry of rodents near the rushes on the floor. Sleep was not comfort, it was necessity. People didn't lie awake longing for comfort. They huddled against it, bore it, endured it. The rhythms of the body adjusted. Generations were born into these conditions and knew no other way to rest. And that might be the most interesting point of all. They adapted not by conquering the cold, but by understanding it. By designing rooms that worked with it. By creating routines, roles, garments, and furniture that turned inhospitable spaces into shelters, even if only just enough to survive the night. Still, we must ask, how did these physical spaces affect the way people thought about sleep, about dreams, about safety? What superstitions, rituals, and beliefs emerged from this cold, dark world where nighttime was a place of both necessity and fear? The cold was only one part of the medieval night. The stone walls and straw bedding, the shared warmth and communal sleep, they were physical answers to a physical problem. But once the torches were extinguished and the bed curtains drawn, something less tangible entered the room. The night itself, with all its imagined dangers, its spirits, and its shadows. For the people of the Middle Ages, night was not simply the absence of light. It was a domain of its own, a place where the soul was vulnerable, where demons might visit in dreams, and where sleep itself held mysteries beyond simple rest. The medieval view of sleep and the night. To sleep was not merely to close one's eyes and drift off, it was to surrender control. In a deeply religious and superstitious society, sleep was both necessary and dangerous. While the body rested, the soul was thought to wander. What it encountered in dreams could carry meaning or menace. People believed that the devil and his agents worked most powerfully at night. The nightmare was not just a bad dream, it was understood quite literally. The mare, a demonic being, was thought to sit upon the chest of the sleeper, causing suffocation, fear, and paralysis. Today, we might call this sleep paralysis. Back then, it was a visitation. Sleep was often split into two parts: first sleep and second sleep. After a few hours of early slumber, many people would wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two. This was seen as natural. Some would pray, reflect, even engage in quiet activities or talk with bedfellows. Then they would return to bed for the second stretch of rest. This segmented sleep mirrored the rhythms of a pre-industrial world, one governed not by clocks but by seasons and light. And it gave rise to nighttime rituals, whispers of prayers in the dark, shared secrets, moments of eerie stillness between the waking and the dream. Rituals, prayers, and protection. Bedtime was often accompanied by spiritual rituals. Nobles and peasants alike recited prayers before sleep. "Now I lay me down to sleep" is a modern echo of much older forms. Medieval people feared dying in their sleep. It was common and seen as dangerous if one had not properly confessed or cleansed their soul. A crucifix near the bed, a relic or a saint's token tucked into the bed curtains, were common protections. Charms, herbs like mugwort or valerian, and even rings inscribed with prayers might be kept nearby to guard against evil spirits. For children, lullabies often included references to angels watching over them. These songs were soothing, yes, but also protective. The darkness was not just a physical condition, it was spiritual territory, and people prepared for it like soldiers entering battle. Nighttime was also associated with illness. Without modern medicine, many fevers worsened at night. People feared the dark not just for what it hid, but for what it revealed: weakness, death, the boundaries between the seen and unseen. Beds as status symbols and political tools. Beyond the fears of the night, the bed itself continued to hold symbolic power. A noble's bed was more than a place to sleep. It was a space of political, marital, and social significance. Royal and noble beds were sometimes set up in public rooms where important guests might see them. Elaborate and ornate, they were designed to display wealth and legitimacy. Receiving visitors from bed, even when not ill, was a display of privilege. You didn't have to rise. You were the center, and others came to you. Marriages were consummated in the bed, sometimes with witnesses. Childbirth happened there too, and eventually, so did death. The bed was not a private space in the modern sense. It was, rather, a stage upon which many of life's most important events were performed. Servants would witness intimate moments. Messages might be passed between beds, between bedchambers. And when kings or nobles were absent from court, their beds might be transported with them, yes, transported. Some elite beds were so important they were dismantled and moved with the household during travel. The more private an individual's bed, the more power they likely held. To sleep alone, with warmth, behind curtains and a guarded door that was luxury. Gender and the bedchamber. The medieval bedroom was also a space where gender roles were sharply defined. Women of noble rank were often confined to their chambers during pregnancy, menstruation, or confinement after childbirth. These bedchambers became mini-worlds governed by midwives, nurses, and female attendants. Men, by contrast, might retreat to the bedchamber for different reasons: illness, privacy, or intimate meetings. But even then, they were rarely alone. Pages, valets, or scribes often remained nearby. This overlapping use of the bedroom as sleeping space, office, sick room, and ceremonial venue meant that the idea of private sleep was foreign to the medieval mind. The smell and the sound of the night. One must not forget that even the most luxurious medieval rooms were not sanitized in the modern sense. Chamber pots were used and emptied, yes, but odors lingered. Bed linens were not washed regularly. People bathed infrequently. The scent of wool, smoke, sweat, and herbs mingled in the air. The soundscape, too, was different. You might hear the coo of pigeons roosting in the rafters, the distant clanking of guards, or the shuffle of rats in the wall. Thunderstorms echoed against stone with alarming force. Doors groaned. And always, there was the wind whistling through the narrow slits of the tower window or pressing cold breath against the shutters. Yet sleep came, it had to. The changing world of sleep. By the end of the Middle Ages, things began to change. Glass windows became more common in noble households. Chimneys were added to rooms, allowing safer fireplaces. Featherbeds replaced straw. Linen became finer. Personal rooms for children and staff slowly emerged in the wealthiest households. But for most of the period, sleep remained a deeply communal, deeply physical, and deeply spiritual act. It was an interaction with the environment, with social structures, and with belief systems. It wasn't always restful. It wasn't always safe. But it was a constant. And perhaps that is why the question still echoes today. How did they stay warm? Not just with fur or fire, but with each other. With ritual, belief, adaptation. With layers of cloth and layers of habit. They didn't always feel warm, but they stayed alive, and that, in the harsh logic of medieval life, was warmth enough. As you imagine the end of the night, the slow creep of morning light through a shuttered window, and the first stirrings of servants below, ask yourself, what stories were lost in those long nights? What dreams? What whispered thoughts behind curtains, beneath tapestries wrapped in wool? In sleep they endured, and in endurance they survived. Story 2. The Great Bed of Ware and the World of Shared Sleeping Spaces. You are walking through a modest-looking room in a quiet English inn, the kind where the air is thick with the scent of old wood and centuries of dust. At first glance, there's nothing out of place until you turn a corner and see it. A bed, so massive and so wide that it dwarfs the room. Nearly 10 feet across, carved with the curling patterns of the late 16th century, its towering posts rise like the beams of a small barn. This is the Great Bed of Ware. And while it is not medieval, its construction dates to the 1590s, it is the perfect entry point into a lesser-known fact of pre-modern life. For much of history, people didn't sleep alone. They didn't even expect to. Let us step back from the single-bed frame and climate-controlled comfort of the modern world. In the pre-industrial past, sleep was almost always communal. And while the Great Bed of Ware is unusually large, it represents something deeply ordinary. The shared experience of sleep in crowded rooms, with shared bedding, and the noise, smell, and vulnerability that came with it. A monument to shared sleep. The Great Bed of Ware was built as a curiosity and innkeeper's gimmick. Designed to sleep 4 couples at once, it quickly gained notoriety. It became a local attraction, famous enough to be mentioned by Shakespeare and later admired by Victorian tourists. Its exaggerated proportions and intricate woodwork were theatrical, meant to impress. But its absurdity rests on a real tradition. Inns, taverns, and homes in medieval and early modern Europe often offered shared beds to travelers. Privacy was rare, and travelers expected to bunk together. In many cases, you might share a bed with a complete stranger, a fellow pilgrim, or a merchant on the road. This wasn't considered improper, it was practical. Beds were valuable property, especially large ones. Even nobles might have only one or two in a household. Guests, children, servants all might be invited to sleep in the same space. It was an economy of warmth, of space, and of custom. And this custom reached far beyond rural inns. Even kings shared beds. Royal sleeping arrangements, intimacy, and politics. Consider this. In many royal courts of Europe, the king's bedchamber was not just a place of rest. It was also a site of ceremony. The ritual of the lever du roi, the king's waking, was a public event. Courtiers might be present as the monarch rose, dressed, and began the day. But it didn't stop there. Trusted nobles or diplomats were often invited to share the royal bed not for physical intimacy, but for political intimacy. To sleep in the same bed as a monarch was a sign of favor. It meant trust. It gave opportunity for whispered counsel, private negotiation, and the forging of alliances beneath the bed curtain. This practice, called bedfellowship, was not considered inappropriate. It crossed gender and rank boundaries and continued well into the early modern period. In this context, a bed like the Great Bed of Ware, large, solid, and welcoming, was not absurd. It was a natural outgrowth of a culture where sleep was social, shared, and imbued with meaning. Commoners and the crowd. If nobles shared beds for politics and display, commoners did so for entirely practical reasons. Peasant homes in the medieval period were small, often single-room dwellings. A family of 6 or more might share one bed, or even just a sleeping platform of straw. Children, parents, and sometimes animals all huddled together. They did not worry about awkwardness. They worried about frostbite, lice, and surviving the night. The idea of the private bedroom is a remarkably recent invention. Before the 18th century, most homes had multifunctional rooms. You cooked, ate, worked, and slept in the same space. Even in towns and cities, the poor rented out beds by the hour. A mattress might be used by 4 or 5 people in rotation, what some called hot bedding. Sleep was not a solitary activity. It was part of the rhythm of the household, noisy and often interrupted. And yet, people adapted. They developed ways of sleeping amid company, wrapped in cloaks, nestled in corners, learning to ignore the sounds of breathing, snoring, or quiet conversations. In such conditions, a large bed wasn't a luxury, it was a community tool. Bed structure and material culture. The physical structure of beds in medieval and early modern Europe reflects this shared reality. Beds were built high off the ground, not for aesthetic reasons but for insulation. Heat rises. Beneath the bed, stored rushes, chamber pots, or even small animals might generate a little warmth. The mattress, a sack filled with straw, feathers, or wool, was laid on ropes or slats. These required regular tightening to maintain firmness. Curtains were common on wealthier beds, but not always for privacy. They kept in heat, kept out drafts, and dimmed the light from candles or hearths. Multiple people might sleep behind a single curtain, cocooned together in a microclimate of shared breath. Bed linens were rarely changed. The notion of cleanliness differed from our own. Woolen blankets were precious. Sheets, if used, were often coarse. Clothing doubled as sleepwear. People kept their head coverings on. Caps and coifs helped retain body heat. But within this practical architecture, symbolic elements emerged. Beds became sites of storytelling, of religious rituals, of birth and death. People prayed beside them. Children were told tales as they drifted off. Elders blessed the household from their beds in their final days. The bed was not only furniture, it was the stage on which the most intimate human experiences played out. The bed as witness. Think for a moment of how many lives passed through a single bed in one rural inn. How many stories whispered before sleep? How many arguments, confessions, fears? How many anonymous travelers, wrapped in the same woolen blanket, rolled over and dreamed in silence? The great bed of Ware is silent now, kept in a museum, no longer sagging beneath the weight of tired bodies. But it remembers. It holds the marks of its occupants' graffiti carved into its posts, initials of long-dead travelers, symbols etched in a moment of boredom or pride. Each mark tells us something, that these beds, these spaces of shared sleep, were more than just accommodations. They were expressions of how people lived together, how they negotiated closeness and distance, how they managed life in a crowded, cold world. And yet, one wonders, how did people sleep soundly in such crowded conditions? With strangers snoring nearby, with animals in the next room, with the threat of theft or pestilence or fire. What did it take to surrender to sleep in a world where true solitude was nearly impossible? It's difficult, perhaps, to imagine today. Lying down in a bed beside a stranger, someone you met only hours earlier on the road, pulling the same rough woolen blanket to your chin, and drifting off to sleep with your back turned, hoping they don't snore too loudly. But for much of European history, especially between the 13th and 17th centuries, this was not only common, it was expected. Whether you were a merchant traveling to a fair, a pilgrim bound for a holy shrine, or a nobleman visiting a remote estate, the odds were high that you'd be sharing your bed. There were practical reasons for this, but also social and cultural expectations that governed the practice. To understand these customs is to understand how early societies navigated questions of privacy, trust, modesty, and necessity, all from under the same blanket. Inns and the economy of bed space. The rise of inns and taverns across medieval and early modern Europe brought with it the problem of sleeping arrangements. As trade routes expanded and religious pilgrimages became widespread, travel increased dramatically. But building private rooms for each traveler was economically impractical, especially in smaller towns. So innkeepers offered what they had, beds, and not always one per guest. A single bed might be rented to multiple travelers at once, often without regard to class, gender in rural places, or social station. Bed sharing was not about intimacy, it was about accommodation. A merchant might share a bed with a stonemason, a scribe, or a sailor. The cost was cheaper than paying for exclusive use. This created what some historians refer to as bed-sharing etiquette. Certain rules were expected. One kept to their side. Conversations were usually minimal. Weapons were placed out of reach. In colder seasons, bedfellows might sleep facing opposite directions, what later became known as foot to head, to reduce the chance of accidental contact and increase coverage under limited bedding. These weren't written laws, but they were commonly understood. Violation of such etiquette could cause conflict or worse, suggest indecent intentions. Legal and religious concerns. The close quarters of shared beds occasionally brought social and legal scrutiny, particularly when misunderstandings or accusations arose. In some cases, courts had to adjudicate whether bed sharing constituted evidence of sexual misconduct. This became especially fraught when the participants were of the same sex or from vastly different social ranks. While the practice itself was normal, the perception of impropriety could be leveraged in disputes over inheritance, marriage, or religious status. Monasteries, for instance, were particularly wary of shared beds. Most monastic rules forbade monks from sleeping two to a bed, and large dormitories were designed with physical barriers or wide spacing between sleeping pallets. Silence was enforced. The goal was not only spiritual discipline, but the prevention of temptation or rumor. In contrast, lay society made few such prohibitions because the need for warmth and rest often overrode fear of gossip. Shared sleep was rarely sexualized unless evidence suggested otherwise. Still, cultural anxieties lingered, especially in high society where appearances mattered. By the early modern period, as moral regulation increased and urban centers expanded, more effort was made to offer separate lodgings. But the tradition of shared beds persisted in inns and private homes well into the 18th century. Domestic arrangements and the role of the guest bed. In the home, the guest bed was a major social asset. Offering someone your bed or space in your bed was a gesture of profound hospitality. It implied trust and generosity. The bed itself might be simple or grand, but it was shared willingly. Wealthier households might keep a separate truckle bed, a low rollout bed stored under the main one for younger guests or attendants. Children might sleep in the same room as adults, even in the same bed, depending on available space. Some houses had bed closets, small alcoves enclosed by wood panels and curtains, tucked in corners of public rooms. These provided a semblance of privacy without dedicated bedrooms. Among the lower classes, bed sharing was an ordinary part of life. In cottages or tenements, where multiple families might occupy the same building, beds were handed down, borrowed, or bartered. A mattress was valuable property. The space it offered was shared according to familial or financial need. This was especially true during times of seasonal labor migration or during harvest festivals, when extra hands and extra bodies meant crowded houses. Children often doubled or tripled up, and older relatives were rarely granted solitary rest. The concept of a spare room was non-existent for most. If space allowed, beds were often placed in the central living area, where fires could provide warmth. Curtains or hangings provided visual barriers but little else. Illness, death, and the presence of others. Perhaps the most emotionally complex aspect of shared beds was how they intersected with sickness and death. In a world before antibiotics, before isolated hospital rooms, a sickbed was often a communal experience. When someone fell ill, they stayed in their usual bed, often surrounded by family, who shared the space both to care for the person and to offer comfort. Children might sleep beside a dying parent. A spouse might remain in bed with a feverish partner. There was no thought of quarantine unless plague was suspected. When death approached, a bed became a sacred space. Clergy might be summoned. Relatives crowded in. Final blessings were spoken from under blankets, amid the smell of sweat, herbs, and burning candles. The presence of others during sleep, then, was not always an inconvenience. It was part of life's major transitions. Some historians suggest this closeness. The daily routine of shared physical space fostered stronger familial bonds, but also blurred boundaries. Personal autonomy was limited. One could not cry privately, think privately, or even dream privately. Yet, as with the great bed of Ware, there was a strange kind of dignity in the shared experience, a closeness that bred resilience. The social function of dreaming allowed. In this era, dreams were not just private affairs. They were often shared aloud in the morning, especially if they were strange or troubling. Bedfellows already nearby became confidants. Dream interpretation rooted in both Christian and folkloric traditions was a popular subject. A dream of water might suggest travel, one of fire, danger, a snake, betrayal. Books like Onera Critica, The Interpretation of Dreams, had been circulating since antiquity, and medieval bestiaries often included dream symbolism. A shared bed became a space not only for physical rest, but for emotional and symbolic reflection. What had you dreamed? What did it mean? Was it a warning? The thin line between the conscious and unconscious world became a communal topic, not a solitary one. And while no one would confuse a bed in a noisy inn with a sacred space, the act of dreaming together, of sleeping in the presence of others, carried meaning that went beyond warmth. An open bed in a cold world. There is a curious strength in the idea of shared sleep, a quiet heroism. To lie beside someone unknown, to accept vulnerability without suspicion, was a social contract of sorts, a testament to trust, or at least tolerance. The great bed of Ware wasn't merely large, it was symbolic of a worldview where the night was not a private matter. In a cold world, beds were made to be shared, not hoarded. Privacy was a myth, comfort a privilege, but survival was always communal. And yet, as time moved forward and societies changed, that old world began to vanish. New values, privacy, solitude, personal space emerged. But what did we lose in the transition? What happens when the bed, once shared by many, becomes a fortress for one? We now stand at the quiet threshold between two very different worlds. In one, sleep was a shared, necessary, unglamorous act carried out in close quarters, often with strangers, in cold stone houses or smoky wooden rooms. In the other, the modern one, sleep is considered private, sometimes even sacred, and tied to notions of rest, self-care, and autonomy. The transition between these worlds didn't happen all at once. It was slow, uneven, and shaped by changes in architecture, medicine, technology, and ideology. But one thing is certain. By the end of the 18th century, the idea of sharing your bed with strangers had started to feel improper. So how did that shift occur? Why did people begin to retreat from communal sleep, and what replaced it? To answer that, we must examine the long goodbye to shared sleeping spaces, a cultural transformation that rewrote not just how we slept, but how we thought about comfort, intimacy, and identity. The architecture of solitude. One of the major drivers of change was architecture. As cities expanded, so did buildings. The rise of urban townhouses and multi-room rural homes allowed more people, especially the emerging middle class, to sleep separately. Instead of one room doing everything, homes began to develop designated functions: a kitchen, a parlor, a dining room, and finally, the bedroom. This was a gradual process, beginning in the late 1600s and accelerating through the 18th and 19th centuries. In wealthier homes, bedchambers were no longer just sleeping spaces, they became private retreats. Books, writing desks, dressing tables, and washstands appeared. The bedroom became a symbol of individual identity, especially for women. Privacy, once unthinkable, became fashionable, and eventually expected. This new architecture of solitude was reflected in social values. Suddenly, to sleep alone was not only a mark of wealth, it was civilized, clean, proper. Even in inns, individual rooms began to be offered, starting in elite establishments and slowly trickling down. By the early 19th century, bed sharing in urban inns was mostly gone, except in the poorest areas or among itinerant workers. And the great bed of Ware, it became a novelty, a relic of a bygone time, a curiosity more than a standard. The rise of hygiene and the fear of contagion. Another key factor in the abandonment of communal sleep was the rise of medical science, and with it, an acute fear of contagion. By the 18th century, physicians began to associate close sleeping arrangements with the spread of disease. Tuberculosis, typhus, and influenza ravaged households and cities alike. Doctors warned against bad air in closed rooms and discouraged bed sharing, especially with the ill. Public health campaigns encouraged better ventilation, separate beds for the sick, and eventually, sleeping apart as a general precaution. This movement toward physical separation wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about control. Disease became a moral concern, and with it came the fear of bodily closeness. Beds were no longer cozy nests, they were battlegrounds against unseen enemies. In the Victorian era, the bed became an instrument of health as much as rest. Mattresses were stuffed with new materials thought to be less hospitable to pests. Iron frames replaced wooden ones to prevent infestations. Beds were raised higher, cleaned more often, and increasingly adorned with white linen, symbols of sterility. As the emphasis on personal hygiene and medical supervision grew, so too did the belief that sleeping alone was not just more comfortable, but safer. The emotional realignment of sleep. But the shift away from communal beds was not driven by practicality alone. It was also emotional, cultural, psychological. In the past, closeness was expected. Modesty was physical, not spatial. You might sleep beside someone without exchanging a word or even knowing their name. But by the 19th century, notions of modesty had changed. The body was to be hidden not just from view, but from proximity. Emotional intimacy began to require physical privacy. Families started assigning children their own rooms. Marriages evolved, too. Some couples now preferred separate beds or even separate bedrooms to preserve personal space. The invention of the modern marital bed, one bed for two people, exclusively for them, emerged in the Victorian period. It was both a symbol of unity and a display of wealth. You didn't have to share. You chose to. This was a radical departure from the world of the great bed of Ware, where the choice to sleep alone was practically unheard of. Industrialization, time discipline, and sleep as efficiency. Another subtle but powerful force changed sleep forever: the clock. Before industrialization, time was dictated by the sun, seasons, and personal rhythm. You slept when it was dark. You woke when it was light. Night was flexible, fluid, even social. But factories demanded schedules. Workers needed to rise at 5 a.m., no matter the season. Time became measurable, and sleep became regulated. Shared beds, with their noise and chaos, were no longer compatible with the new need for uninterrupted rest. Productivity required quiet. A good night's sleep became a moral virtue, something tied to efficiency, not just survival. The 8 hours of sleep ideal was born. Sleep was no longer something you endured, it was something you optimized. This shift contributed to the architecture of the modern bedroom, a place of silence, order, and darkness, not a place of conversation or community but of function, of solitude. The ghost of the Great Bed. Today, the Great Bed of Ware rests in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. No one sleeps in it now, but when you stand beside it, you feel its gravity, not just physical but historical. It is a monument to a different idea of sleep, a time when the night was not about peace or comfort, but about survival and companionship. A time when beds were rarely empty, when strangers became bedfellows, and when rest meant more than isolation. There's something human in that old bed, something lost. We may now enjoy the comforts of memory foam and central heating, of blackout curtains and noise machines, but the Great Bed of Ware reminds us that, for centuries, sleep was not a private act. It was shared, lived, endured. One can't help but wonder, in our pursuit of personal space, did we also lose something softer, some sense of kinship in the quiet hours, some understanding of how to sleep not alone, but together? Because in the end, the story of the Great Bed is not just about furniture or architecture. It's about how people managed their lives in the dark, how they touched shoulders in sleep, how they trusted, how they made room for each other. Story 3. Wool, Fleece, and Fire, Materials of Warmth in the Middle Ages. There is something elemental about the cold, a force so quiet and persistent that it slips into every crack of daily life, every breath, every pause between footsteps on a frozen stone floor. In the Middle Ages, the cold wasn't just a nuisance. It was a condition of existence. And in a world without central heating, thermal underwear, or electric blankets, warmth had to be earned. It came from what you wore, what you burned, what you slept under, and how well you layered your day against the night. In this story, we move away from rooms and rituals and into the very fibers of survival: wool, fleece, and fire. These were the humble materials that made the difference between enduring the winter and succumbing to it. They were not luxuries. They were life. Climate and cold, a constant companion. To understand the medieval relationship with warmth, we must first consider the climate. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, Europe experienced what scholars call the medieval warm period, followed later by the onset of the Little Ice Age. Even during the warm period, winters were long, nights were bitter, and indoor temperatures barely differed from those outside. A house, whether peasant's hut or noble's manor, had walls, yes, but insulation in the modern sense did not exist. The cold was a given, and much of daily life was spent negotiating with it. The body needed heat, but in a world where even the sun vanished early for half the year, the question became, how can we keep warmth close to the skin, and how can we keep it there all night? Wool, the backbone of medieval warmth. The single most important material in this quest was wool. Sheep were ubiquitous in medieval Europe. They grazed on common land, provided meat and milk, but most critically, their fleece was sheared, spun, and woven into the fabric of survival. Wool was valued not for its elegance, but for its practicality. It could retain warmth even when damp, a vital trait in the wet winters of northern Europe. Everyone wore it. From coarse, undyed tunics for peasants to richly dyed wool gowns for the gentry, wool was the great equalizer. It was spun at home, carded by hand, and woven in small looms. Children learned to work with it early. Even the poorest families knew how to make basic woolen garments. For sleep, wool appeared in blankets, cloaks, bed hangings, and even the stuffing of mattresses. A wool-stuffed mattress retained heat better than straw, and while feathers were preferred by the wealthy, wool was more accessible and still effective. Layers mattered. People didn't rely on a single heavy blanket. Instead, they built warmth from many thin layers, each trapping air, each retaining a fraction of body heat. A peasant family might sleep in all their clothes, wrapped in 2 or 3 woolen coverings. The wealthy added fur, but always at the base of it was wool. Its ubiquity made it unremarkable at the time, but when we look back, it's clear. Wool was warmth. Fleece and fur, the layers of luxury and necessity. While wool was common, fleece and fur represented something more layered both literally and socially. Fleece often referred to the soft, freshly shorn wool from sheep, used before spinning for extra warmth. It might be wrapped in linen and sewn into blankets, used to stuff pillows, or even packed around beds during extreme cold. Its use was intimate, close to the skin, not for show. Fur, on the other hand, marked a boundary between status and survival. Peasants rarely wore fur. If they did, it came from local animals, rabbit, squirrel, or sheepskin, and even then it was turned fur side inward. The warmth was for the wearer, not for appearance. Nobles, however, wore fur openly. Ermine, marten, fox, sable, the rarer and finer the pelt, the higher the rank of its wearer. Furs lined cloaks, trimmed sleeves, and draped across shoulders. In bed, fur-lined coverlets were treasured for their insulating power. For all its elegance, fur was practical. It trapped heat better than almost any fabric available. In northern climates, where wind cut through stone and snow crept through window frames, a fur-lined cloak or bedspread could mean the difference between a restless night and a tolerable one. Even monasteries renowned for austerity made allowances for fur during winter. Monks might wear fur-lined habits or allow sheepskins in their cells. The body needed what the spirit could not do without: warmth. The hearth, a flickering heart. Of course, garments and blankets were only one side of the equation. The other was fire-controlled, contained, and precious. In a medieval home, the hearth was the center of everything. It was where food was cooked, where light was made, and where warmth radiated, if only in a small circle. In peasant homes, the hearth was often just a hole in the ground or a raised stone platform. Smoke escaped through a thatched roof or small vent. There were no chimneys for most of the Middle Ages. This meant rooms filled with smoke. Walls were blackened, ceilings low and sooty, but people tolerated it. The smoke helped preserve wooden beams and even discouraged pests, and more importantly, the fire gave heat. Wood was the standard fuel. In some areas, peat or dung supplemented it. Forests were carefully managed not for conservation but for survival. Gathering wood was daily labor. A well-stocked woodpile was a source of pride. Fires burned low overnight. To maintain embers until morning, families covered them with ash or banked them carefully. If the fire died, relighting it was a chore, and in some villages, it was forbidden to borrow fire from neighbors to prevent the spread of flames. You had to tend your own warmth. In castles, fireplaces began to appear by the 12th century, and by the 14th, chimneys were more common in elite residences. But even there, fires were limited to key rooms: the Great Hall, the kitchen, perhaps one bedchamber. Most rooms remained cold. So again, people returned to layers of fabric, of routine, of habit. Warmth as a ritual. Staying warm wasn't just a question of materials. It was a practice, a ritual embedded into daily life. Before bed, people gathered near the fire. They wrapped their feet in cloth. They drank warm ale, broth, or spiced wine. They told stories, sang psalms, or murmured prayers, all while letting the heat soak into their limbs. Bed warmers' metal pans filled with coals were passed between sheets in noble households. Cloaks were used as blankets. In the coldest regions, people slept in shifts, with one person keeping watch near the hearth to tend the embers. Children were swaddled tightly. The elderly, especially vulnerable to cold, were given the best furs or placed closest to warmth. Communities looked after their weakest, because the cold didn't discriminate, but people could. And every winter the cycle repeated. The storing of wood, the mending of wool, the hunting of fur, the huddling around the hearth. They didn't conquer the cold, they learned to live with it. But what of fire's danger? What happened when warmth turned to flame, when the hearth betrayed its purpose? In the flicker of every medieval fire was a risk that changed the design of buildings, the shape of routines, and even the rhythms of sleep itself. The hearth gave life. It provided heat for cooking, boiling, drying, and above all, surviving the cold. But in the flickering shadows of every firelight was a lurking danger, a threat that haunted every wooden beam, thatched roof, and tapestry-draped wall of medieval Europe: accidental fire. In this section, we turn our attention to the paradox of warmth. The same fire that made life tolerable could also destroy it in minutes. And while wool and fleece were the great insulators of the body, fire dictated how buildings were made, how people slept, and how they managed risk, hour by hour, winter after winter. The ever-present threat of fire. In a world built largely of wood, straw, and dried rushes, fire was as dangerous as it was necessary. Peasant homes were simple timber-framed huts, often coated with daub and wattle or thin layers of plaster. Their roofs were usually thatched dried straw or reeds that ignited easily and burned fast. One spark from a chimneyless hearth, one gust of wind through an open shutter, and a house or an entire village could be engulfed. Even stone castles weren't immune. Interiors were still filled with wood: floors, ceilings, doors, furniture, wall hangings. Drapes, bed curtains, woolen cloaks, all combustible. Fire didn't need much to spread. A dropped candle, an overturned brazier, a poorly banked ember. Municipal records from medieval towns across England and the continent include frequent mentions of destructive fires. In London, the fire of 1212 killed an estimated 3,000 people. In other towns, entire districts were wiped out by a single kitchen accident. So how did people adapt? How did they manage warmth without letting it consume them? Hearth management and nighttime fire discipline. One of the most basic practices of the medieval night was banking the fire. This meant covering the live coals of a hearth with ash or turf to smother the flame, but retain the embers. In the morning, the fire could be revived by gently uncovering the coals and adding fresh kindling. This nightly ritual was essential. If a fire burned too low, It might die completely, meaning cold breakfasts and hard starts. But if it flared too high overnight, it might catch a rush mat, a hanging cloth, or a timber beam. To avoid this, cooking fires were often separated from sleeping spaces. In manors or castles, the kitchen might be located in an entirely different building or wing connected by stone corridors. This separation reduced warmth but preserved safety. The servants, who worked closest to fire, also slept closest to its danger. Nighttime in noble households meant strict fire discipline. Bedchambers were only allowed small braziers, metal pans filled with coals and placed in the center of the room. Even these were carefully monitored, sometimes removed before sleep. In towns, curfews originally referred to cover fires, a bell that signaled it was time to extinguish household fires for the night. This regulation was meant to prevent nighttime blazes. The word curfew comes from the Old French couvre-feu, literally, cover the fire. It was a sound of control, of caution. When the curfew bell rang, warmth was put away until morning. Fireproofing, medieval style. Architects and builders developed their own solutions to the fire problem. By the late Middle Ages, chimneys became more common, especially in wealthier homes. These vertical stone shafts drew smoke out of the house more effectively and reduced the spread of sparks. Their addition meant more rooms could be heated safely, but chimneys were expensive and difficult to construct. For many, hearths remained open and unventilated. In townhouses, particularly in the dense medieval quarters of London, Paris, or Bruges, firewalls were sometimes added between buildings. Stone staircases and plaster coatings helped limit the spread of flames. Windows were fitted with wooden shutters that could be quickly closed in the event of smoke or fire. In monasteries, strict codes of conduct governed the use of fire. Monks were not allowed to light personal fires in their cells, and heating was often restricted to communal areas like the refectory or infirmary. Cold was tolerated in the name of discipline, and fire was feared as a threat to spiritual and physical order. Still, despite precautions, disasters happened. It was not unusual for fire to be listed among the top threats in wills, town ordinances, or religious texts. People prayed for protection from it. They feared it the way we might fear flood or famine. And yet fire remained essential. The trade-off was accepted. Without fire, there was no bread, no light, no warmth. Clothing and fire safety, or the lack thereof. The same materials that preserved body heat also posed danger in the presence of flame. Wool, fortunately, has some fire-retardant properties. It tends to smolder rather than burst into flame. This may be one reason it remained so popular. Linen, by contrast, burns quickly, as do hemp and cotton. Silk, a luxury material imported in limited quantities, could be flammable and clung to the skin when burned. Peasant clothing, made of coarse wool and undyed cloth, was more fire-resistant by accident than design. Still, burns were common injuries, particularly for women who cooked over open hearths while wearing long, layered skirts. Children and the elderly were at highest risk. Their reduced mobility made them vulnerable near open flame. Some households placed low wooden barriers, primitive hearth guards, around fires to keep children at bay. And in wealthier homes, servants were trained in fire control. A spilled brazier could end in dismissal or worse, execution if it endangered a lord's chamber or the manor hall. Fire worship, fire superstition. Beyond the practical, fire held deep symbolic meaning in medieval life. It was associated with divine judgment, spiritual purification, and seasonal ritual. The hearth was sacred. In many homes, it was customary to bless the fire at the start of winter or on holy days. Ashes were kept and used for medicinal or spiritual purposes. Certain superstitions surrounded fire at night. A fire left untended might invite spirits or misfortune. A hearth that smoked excessively could indicate unrest in the home or a death to come. It was considered bad luck to light a fire with another's coals without permission. Even in sleep, fire was thought to have a presence. Dreaming of fire might symbolize passion, sin, or divine anger. A dream of a house burning was particularly ominous. And in darker corners of folklore, witches were said to steal embers from hearths to cast spells or spread illness. The medieval fire was more than just physical heat, it was spiritual terrain. Sleep and flame, a fragile coexistence. Imagine lying in a cold stone chamber, wrapped in a woolen cloak, the faint smell of smoke in the air. A single ember glows in a small brazier. There's warmth but not trust. One gust of wind, one careless spark, one forgotten taper, and the room could vanish into flame. Medieval people lived with this knowledge, every day, every night. It shaped how they slept cautiously, layered, aware. It shaped how they built, how they prayed, how they trained their children. Warmth was a necessity, yes, but always a dangerous one. And in the long, cold months of a medieval winter, the question was not simply, how do we stay warm? It was, how close to the flame can we live without being consumed by it? If the cold defined the conditions of medieval life, then warmth defined the choices. Every layer of wool, every crackling fire, every stitch of fur-lined clothing told a quiet story not just of practicality, but of survival, economy, and identity. In this final section, we'll pull the thread through history and examine how the materials used to keep warm weren't just physical solutions to the cold, they were foundational to how people lived, worked, traded, and governed their world. Warmth, it turns out, shaped more than beds and cloaks. It shaped commerce, religion, class, and empire. The wool trade, a quiet engine of medieval Europe. By the 13th century, wool was not just the primary clothing fiber in Europe, it was the lifeblood of international trade. In England especially, wool was called the jewel in the realm. Vast sheep pastures covered the countryside. Monasteries raised flocks. Nobles enclosed common land to expand their holdings. English wool, particularly from the Cotswolds and the Welsh borderlands, was prized across Europe for its long, strong fibers. Exported raw or spun into yarn, English wool fed the booming textile centers of Flanders, northern Italy, and later France. The town of Bruges, for example, became a hub for weaving and dyeing, transforming rough fleece into fine cloth. Wool paid for castles, it financed crusades, it lined the pockets of merchants and monarchs alike. The English Parliament itself, still in use today, sits atop a symbolic foundation. The Lord Chancellor's seat is known as the Woolsack, a literal cushion stuffed with wool. It remains a quiet reminder of wool's historical importance. And yet, beneath this economic engine was the most basic human truth. People needed to stay warm. That need drove breeding, spinning, labor, and law. Warmth wasn't a luxury, it was a market. Labor, gender, and the spindle. Behind every woolen blanket, there was labor, quiet, repetitive, skilled. Spinning and weaving were mostly women's work. In peasant homes, the sight of a woman at a drop spindle or hand loom was so common that it defined gender roles. The word spinster comes from this tradition, a woman who spun wool, often unmarried, working long hours beside the hearth. Children helped card fleece, removing burrs and tangles. Older women spun. Men sheared sheep and sometimes wove, especially in urban guild settings. But for centuries, the transformation of fleece into fabric was rooted in domestic rhythms. In towns, weaving guilds emerged. These organizations regulated the quality and price of cloth. Guilds were powerful not only economically, but politically. A wealthy cloth merchant could wield more influence than a landed knight. As towns grew, spinning wheels replaced hand spindles, speeding production. Wool became increasingly refined. Garments, once purely functional, gained symbolic power. A fine wool cloak marked status. A colored wool tunic showed regional affiliation or wealth. Even monastic robes, simple, Undyed wool communicated discipline and humility. The warmth you wore became a language of identity. The politics of fur. If wool clothed the masses, fur divided them. Sumptuary laws rules that dictated who could wear what regulated fur strictly in many parts of Europe. Only nobility could wear ermine or sable. Only the wealthy could line their cloaks with fox or marten. These laws weren't just about economy, they were about order. Fur showed where you stood in the social hierarchy. To wear the wrong kind of fur, without the right blood or title, was not only a faux pas, it could be illegal. But the practicality of fur was hard to ignore. In cold climates, even the poorest sought animal skins. In the north, reindeer and bear pelts were used. In more temperate zones, rabbit, badger, or sheep. These were usually worn fur-side and not for display, but for warmth. Churches frowned upon ostentatious fur. Monasteries often forbade it. And yet, during plague years, furs were believed to protect against bad air. Merchants hoarded them. Priests wrapped themselves in pelts as they ministered to the sick. The contradictions were many. Fur was both a luxury and a necessity, both sacred and profane, both practical and political. Fire and the hearth, shaping space and spirit. If wool and fur clothed the body, fire shaped the space around it. The hearth was not just a heat source, it was the anchor of domestic life. Meals were prepared over it. Stories were told around it. Embers glowed through the night, warding off cold and evil alike. In literature, the hearth is often used as a symbol of home, of security. But in reality, it was a precarious thing dependent on fuel, on labor, on vigilance. Someone always had to tend the fire. A family without wood or dung was a family at risk. Communal spaces were organized around fire. In great halls, people clustered near the central hearth. In peasant huts, families sat shoulder to shoulder near the smoke. Even in monasteries, the single warmed room, the calefactory, became a place of quiet gathering. The placement of fire influenced architecture. Hearths at the center of houses, later pushed to walls with the advent of chimneys. Fireplaces became focal points, not just practical but decorative. And in times of illness, fire became medicinal. Hot stones, heated cloths, and steam were all part of the medieval understanding of healing. Warmth was health, cold was danger. The legacy of warmth. When we consider the medieval world, we often focus on war, religion, kings, and conquests. But beneath all of that, quite literally beneath the layers, was a quiet, daily struggle to stay warm. This struggle defined agriculture for wool, hunting for fur, architecture for fire safety, and family roles in tending hearths and making cloth. It dictated trade routes. It influenced religious practices. It touched the lives of every class from serfs to sovereigns. Even today, remnants of this history remain. We wear wool coats in winter. We decorate fireplaces in our homes. We give fleece blankets as gifts. We still speak of keeping the home fires burning. These are echoes, faint but persistent, of a time when warmth was the axis around which life turned. So next time you pull a blanket up on a cold night, or sit by a heater and feel the chill leave your fingers, consider this. In the Middle Ages, that moment would have been earned. Through labor, through firewood, through the lives of sheep and the skill of hands. Every ounce of warmth cost time, material, and effort. And it still does, though we may no longer see the threads. Story 4. Servants in the Shadows. Where did castle staff sleep? A castle is built for defense. It's constructed to outlast siege, to withstand storms, to intimidate rivals, and to house nobles in rooms carved from thick stone. But behind every lord's canopy bed, every candle-lit feast, and every roaring fire in the great hall, there were dozens, sometimes hundreds of people who made it all possible. They were the castle staff, the cooks, the maids, the grooms, the guards, the scullions, the nurses, the clerks, the washerwomen, the porters. And they worked from before dawn to well after dark, ensuring that every wheel turned as it should. But when the torches were extinguished and the nobles retired to their chambers, where did these workers sleep? This story explores the forgotten geography of the castle, the hidden places where staff lived and rested, the makeshift beds, the cold nooks, the crowded chambers. These were not people of leisure, and their sleep was not a reward. It was a pause between burdens. The castle as a workplace. To understand where the staff slept, we must first understand the nature of a medieval castle. These were not hotels. They were not designed with guest suites or staff quarters in the modern sense. Instead, they were fortified homes, often evolving over generations from Matan Bailey wooden towers to elaborate stone keeps with baileys, courtyards, and multiple levels. Every square foot had to be used efficiently, especially in early castles. And so, servants slept where they worked. The kitchen boy might sleep near the hearth. The laundress might sleep near the washing tub. The groom might bed down in the stable. Servants were not granted privacy or personal rooms. Their rest was functional, communal, and temporary. Sleeping in shifts and shared spaces. The most important thing to know is this: castle servants slept in shifts. Few had long, uninterrupted hours of rest. Duties were constant. Fires had to be stoked, bread had to rise overnight, animals had to be watched, torches had to be replaced. As a result, many servants learned to sleep lightly, briefly, and communally. Guards, for example, rotated through day and night watches. Some slept in gatehouses, curled up on benches or bare boards. Others might rest in the armory, using cloaks for blankets and helmets as pillows. Their sleep was always vulnerable, never fully at ease. Kitchen workers sometimes laid down near the embers of the cooking fire, using sacks of grain or bundles of rags as bedding. If the kitchen was located in a separate wing or building, this could be one of the warmer spots in the castle. Maids and chamber servants, who had to rise early to prepare bedchambers or fetch water, often slept in narrow side passages, on pallets in storerooms, or even at the foot of their master's bed if they served a high-ranking individual. The role of status among staff. Even among the staff, hierarchy shaped sleeping conditions. A senior steward, responsible for overseeing household finances and logistics, might be given a small private chamber, perhaps even one with a narrow window and a fireplace. His duties required rest and sharp judgment. His proximity to the lord or lady demanded a bit of dignity. Similarly, a lady's maid, especially one raised in the household, might sleep in a truckle bed beneath her mistress's bed, or in a small annex of the lady's chamber. She was expected to be on call throughout the night for medical emergencies, infant care, or sudden whims. But lower-ranking servants, scullions, errand boys, outdoor workers had no such luxuries. They might sleep in the hall after everyone else had gone to bed. Some slept in storage lofts where sacks of flour, barrels of ale, or tools were kept. These spaces were often cold, drafty, and full of vermin. Rats and fleas were common. Bedding was minimal, often just straw stuffed into sacks, covered by a wool cloak or rough blanket. Dormitories for servants, a rare luxury. By the late Middle Ages, some larger castles included designated dormitories for staff. These were long, shared rooms typically above the stables or adjacent to the kitchen block, where groups of workers could rest between shifts. Beds were often arranged side by side, or in narrow cubicles separated by wooden partitions. The goal wasn't comfort, it was efficiency and containment. Privacy didn't exist, and yet among these narrow beds and coarse wool blankets, a sense of community formed. Servants told stories, sang softly, shared gossip, or whispered prayers before sleep. These dormitories were also strategic. Keeping staff together in one part of the castle made them easier to manage and ensured they could be summoned quickly if needed. The Great Hall and nighttime transformation. In many castles, the Great Hall served as a multi-purpose space. Dining room by day, courtroom by morning, and sleeping quarters by night. While the lord and lady had their own chambers, guests, lower servants, and retainers often slept right there on the stone or wooden floor, especially during times of travel, celebration, or siege. At the end of the evening, the long tables were cleared, and rushes, a mix of straw and herbs, were laid down or refreshed. Servants would roll out bedrolls or cloaks and sleep where they could. The fire in the hearth would burn low, light would fade, and in the quiet between the snoring and coughing and shifting bodies, one could feel the castle holding its breath just for a few hours. Personal belongings and sleeping comforts. Servants owned very little. A small chest or box might hold their entire worldly possessions: a change of linen, a comb, a rosary, perhaps a spoon or cup. Bedding, if they had any, was usually provided by the castle, but provided is a generous word. Most slept with what they wore during the day. In colder regions, servants sometimes shared body heat, sleeping 2 or 3 to a pallet for warmth. There was no shame in it, it was expected. Head coverings, nightcaps, or hoods were common, even indoors. Socks or foot wraps made from cloth scraps helped retain warmth. Some servants placed hot stones in cloth bags near their feet, though these quickly cooled. In wealthier households, bed curtains might be offered to higher-ranking staff. But for most, sleep meant huddling against the cold, pulling wool tight to the chin, and hopping the night past quietly. So we return to the question, where did the castle staff sleep? They slept everywhere and nowhere: in corners, on floors, in alcoves and attics, by the fire and beneath the stairs. Their rest was as scattered as their labor, as humble as their station. They didn't ask, "Where is my bed?" They asked, "Where is there space tonight?" And as they closed their eyes, feet sore and muscles aching, the castle above them fell quiet. The lords dreamed behind heavy curtains. The embers glowed faintly. The cold crept in. But still sleep came. By day, a medieval castle bustled with activity. Fires were lit, bread was baked, horses were fed, and floors were swept. But by night, something changed. The rooms grew dark. The stone walls whispered with wind. The main doors were bolted. And while the noble family retired behind heavy doors and thick curtains, not all of the staff were permitted to sleep. In this section, we focus on the sleepless roles, those servants whose work continued long after sundown. We'll explore the expectations placed upon night staff, the order and hierarchy of the castle household, and how rest was rationed according to duty, trust, and rank. Because sleep in a medieval castle was not simply a matter of need. It was a privilege distributed according to usefulness. Night watch, the sleepless guardians. Every castle had a watch, a small group of guards or retainers responsible for patrolling the grounds after dark. This was as much about internal discipline as external defense. Night watchmen rotated their duties, typically working in short shifts of 2 to 4 hours. In larger castles, bell towers or parapets were manned through the night, and guards walked the perimeter at regular intervals. Their duties included checking for open gates or unlatched doors, watching for fire hazards or smoke, monitoring strange noises or movements, protecting the lord's chambers from intrusion. To keep awake, guards paced in pairs, talked quietly, or splashed cold water on their faces. Falling asleep on duty could lead to punishment or even death, especially during times of unrest or siege. These guards didn't sleep in beds. Between shifts, they rested on benches, furs, or against walls. Some warmed themselves by braziers in the guardroom. Sleep was fragmented, shallow, and constantly interrupted. Their reward: slightly higher status than lower staff and a better meal the next day. Chamberlains and personal servants. If the lord or lady stirred in the night, whether for illness, need, or sudden thought, it was the chamberlain, valet, or lady's maid who responded. These personal attendants had to sleep lightly and close by. Their duties included assisting with late-night chamber pot use, bringing water or herbs, managing clothing or bedding, alerting other staff if emergencies occurred. They were often trusted confidants, privy to family secrets, health problems, or quiet conversations. But this trust came with a cost, almost no rest. A chamberlain might sleep on a truckle bed, a low, wheeled bed pushed beneath the main bed, or in an adjacent alcove. Their bed had no curtains, no privacy, and no real comfort. It was there so they could rise instantly when called. If the lord traveled, so did the chamberlain. Their bed was wherever their master's feet landed. The upstairs-downstairs dynamic. We often think of nobles and staff as two separate classes, but their worlds overlapped constantly, especially at night. In many castles, staff slept in the same room as their masters, or just beyond a curtain or screen. This proximity blurred boundaries of status and privacy. A servant might hear conversations not meant for their ears. They might witness illness, intimacy, or conflict. It was understood that staff were to remain discreet. Loyalty and silence were traits more valuable than efficiency. At the same time, this closeness created complex relationships. Some servants became confidants. Others became pawns in household politics. Many walked a fine line between being invisible and indispensable. The staff hierarchy, who slept where and why. Just as nobles had ranks, so too did the staff, and those ranks determined sleeping conditions. High-ranking household staff included the steward, who managed finances and provisions, the marshal, who oversaw horses and stables, the butler, responsible for the wine cellar and silver, the cook, who governed the kitchen staff. These individuals might have their own chambers, albeit modest. Their roles required judgment and oversight. Their rest was protected somewhat. Mid-level servants, like ladies' maids, pages, or clerks, slept in shared rooms, often near their work areas. They might have mattresses or cots. Privacy was minimal. Lower-ranking staff, such as scullions, stable hands, and kitchen boys, slept wherever there was space: lofts, storerooms, floors, under benches. Their sleeping spots might change nightly. It was not uncommon for younger pages or servants to sleep communally in a single large room, an early form of a dormitory. There, the rules of behavior were strict: lights out at a certain hour, no talking, and early rising. The winter problem. In winter, sleep became even more difficult. Only a few rooms in the castle were heated: the kitchen, the great hall, and perhaps the lord's chamber. Everywhere else, cold seeped through the walls. Servants fought for spots near the embers. Sleeping cloaks, extra stockings, and wool caps were treasured. Many staff slept in their work clothes, layering garments instead of changing for bed. Children in service, pages or maidens, were sometimes placed in attics or basements, where temperatures were low and ventilation was poor. Respiratory illnesses were common, as were frostbite and lice. Yet few complained. A place to sleep, even a cold one, was still a privilege. And unlike peasants in the fields, castle staff at least had stone walls and occasional access to fire. Religious staff and monastic influence. Some castles, especially in ecclesiastical or royal households, included chaplains, scribes, and even monastic retainers. These individuals often followed monastic sleeping rules, such as sleeping in a communal dormitory, rising for night prayers, matins or vigils, wearing simple linen or woolen robes. Their schedules aligned with religious rhythms more than practical ones. Sleep was segmented, ascetic, and rarely uninterrupted. While not manual laborers, their spiritual duties often extended into the night. Some were required to read scripture aloud to the sleeping, a practice meant to ward off demons or bad dreams. Night as a time of vulnerability. At night, the castle changed. The chatter faded. The halls emptied. The echo of boots on stone was replaced by the soft shift of straw and the flicker of dying embers. For servants, nighttime was not a reprieve, it was a risk. Thieves might strike, fires might break out, illness might worsen, and always there was the unrelenting cold. But still the staff persisted. They curled into corners. They shared body heat. They wrapped themselves in whatever cloth was available. And they dreamed briefly, lightly, as their work allowed. Because the day would come soon. And with it, the sound of bells, of clattering pails, of horses in the yard, of doors opening, of nobles calling. And so sleep, when it came, was precious but always temporary. You've seen the castle's stone walls, its lavish chambers, and the echoes of its grand halls, but those are not the spaces where most lives unfolded. For the countless men, women, and children who worked behind the scenes, the castle was not a symbol of power. It was a workplace, a labyrinth of duty. And when their work ended late, always late, the question was not, "Is my bed ready?" but rather, "Where can I find a moment to sleep?" In this final section, we look not just at where staff slept, but at how they lived with exhaustion, how they adapted to fragmented rest, how they bore the physical and emotional toll of working in a place that never fully slept. Because the real story of castle servants is not just where they laid their heads, but how they survived in a world that gave them everything to do and almost nowhere to do it in peace. The nature of fatigue in a castle. Today we talk of exhaustion in terms of overwork or screen time. But for a medieval servant, fatigue was physical, total, and constant. A kitchen maid might rise before dawn to start the fire, prepare dough, fetch water, clean pans, carry meat, and wash linens all before the Lord had risen. A page might spend the entire day standing in a hall, ready to fetch a goblet or run a message at a moment's notice. A laundress might haul linens to the river, scrub them with lye, beat them against rocks, and carry them back up steep paths. And when the work paused, a few hours of rest, maybe, on straw, wrapped in a cloak still damp from the river or still dusty from the stables. This was not the kind of fatigue that sleep erased. It was a daily erosion, a background hum in the bones. Adaptation through routine. Despite the hardship, people adapted. Medieval workers didn't expect 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Instead, they slept in segments, short bursts of rest between tasks. Some learned to doze while sitting up. Others caught moments of sleep during lulls when dough was rising, when the hearth was quiet, when the nobleman was in deep sleep. Polyphasic sleep, a term we use today for multiple sleep intervals, was simply a necessity then. A servant's day might include a few hours of sleep after midnight, a nap at midday, rest during long prayers or services, short dozing periods during travel or wait times. Sleep was a resource to be grabbed, when possible not a ritual to be preserved. In this, servants were incredibly adaptable. They trained their bodies to rest quickly, to sleep deeply when safe, and to awaken immediately when called. Health consequences and shortened lives. Fatigue, overwork, poor nutrition, and bad sleeping conditions came at a cost. Chronic illness was common. Back problems, arthritis, respiratory infections, and exhaustion-related accidents occurred regularly. Injuries were treated with herbs, ointments, or more often ignored until they worsened. The average life expectancy for a lower-ranking servant, particularly one in hard labor, was shorter than that of their noble counterparts. Many died young, or were dismissed when they could no longer perform strenuous duties. Women, especially, bore a heavy load. Female servants performed both domestic and care work, cleaning, cooking, nursing, even childbirth assistance, and were rarely given time to recover from illness or injury. Old age, if reached, was often spent in reduced roles. An aging servant might become a nursemaid or be sent to live in a religious hospital or almshouse if the Lord provided for them. And yet service offered one thing most peasants didn't have: shelter. In exchange for their labor, servants lived inside stone walls, protected from weather, thieves, and raiders. Even if their sleep was poor, it was indoors. Bonds and silent community. Within these difficult conditions, something else emerged: community. Servants often formed deep bonds with each other, born of shared hardship and long hours. They watched over one another's rest, helped with injuries, whispered encouragements in the dark. Even in the coldest dormitories or draftiest corridors, these workers shared warmth, physical and emotional. Cloaks were offered, shifts were covered, embers were shared. In these connections there was resilience, a collective spirit. And sometimes it wasn't just fellow servants who took notice. A loyal valet might earn a lord's favor. A clever maid might be granted a small room. A nurse who served for decades might be buried with honors, mentioned in a will. In rare cases, servants even rose in status, becoming stewards, bailiffs, or trusted advisors. But most didn't rise, they endured. Memory without monument. Unlike the lords and ladies they served, castle servants left few records. Their names were often unrecorded, their sleep unremembered. But the truth is, they were the ones who made the castle function, who lit the fires, turned the spits, opened the gates, and tended the beds. They did not have canopies. They did not have feather mattresses. They did not have privacy. They had stone, straw, wool, and each other. Their lives were invisible by design, but their sleep, fleeting, stolen, brave, was as real and human as any king. As we close this story, we ask, if a servant slept for just 4 hours a night on a straw mat beside the hearth, and woke before the sun to carry water across frozen stone, did they dream? And if they didn't, did the castle, ever so briefly, belong to them? Story 5. Chambers of Power, Royal Bedrooms and Their Hidden Politics. The image of a king or queen at rest is often painted in hues of peace: thick velvet drapes, golden candlelight, and silence behind embroidered bed curtains. But behind those layers of cloth and stone was an entirely different story, one of politics, performance, and power. The royal bedroom was never just a place to sleep. In this story, we explore the most intimate space in the medieval and early modern royal world: the bedchamber. Not only a place for sleep, the royal bedroom was a carefully constructed stage where alliances were made, policies whispered, and every movement was monitored. The monarch may have ruled by day, but at night, behind closed doors, the real court never stopped. The bedchamber as a political space. Modern sensibilities might see the bedroom as a sanctuary, a private space. In the medieval and early modern world, privacy was a luxury few monarchs enjoyed. The royal bedchamber was both a personal and public space. It was here that kings awoke to be dressed by courtiers, received ambassadors in informal settings, and conducted sensitive negotiations out of earshot from the larger court. In France, England, and much of continental Europe, there were elaborate rituals governing how the king or queen rose in the morning and retired at night. These rituals, known as the lever and coucher, were public spectacles. Attending the monarch at these moments wasn't about helping them bathe or change. It was about access. Only the most favored courtiers were invited. To hand the king his shirt or help the queen into her robe was not a chore, it was a mark of status. It was influence. Rituals of awakening and sleeping. The lever du roi, the king's rising, was especially codified in the court of Louis XIV of France. By the late 17th century, the Sun King had turned his bedroom into a theater of power. Each morning at Versailles, dozens of nobles would gather outside the king's bedchamber. At a specific hour, they were allowed in by rank. First, physicians and high clergy to check the king's health. Then, nobles who assisted in dressing. Finally, a wider group of courtiers for the public morning audience. Every item, stockings, shirt, garter, was handed to the king by someone of appropriate rank. There was a protocol for every motion. The king didn't just rise, he performed rising, and those present maneuvered for favor, gossip, and position. The coucher, or bedtime ritual, followed a similar pattern. Even the act of going to sleep was layered in symbolic significance. It showed that the monarch was, like all others, subject to the rhythms of life, but unlike others, surrounded by ceremony even in slumber. The royal bed, not always for sleeping. It is important to understand that the royal bed was not used solely for rest. In many palaces, the bed was placed in the state bedchamber, a room not primarily meant for sleep, but for display. Here, the monarch might hold council, receive dignitaries, or sit beneath the bed canopy to review documents. The bed itself was massive, often raised on a platform and surrounded by luxurious curtains. Ironically, most kings and queens did not sleep in these beds. They had smaller, more private rooms, hidden chambers beyond the official bedroom, where actual sleep occurred. But the state bed remained central. It symbolized power. It was where royal heirs were conceived, where queens gave birth, and where kings might die. Some monarchs received their last audience from the bed. In death, as in life, the bed was not private, it was political. Access to the bed, a map of power. Who was allowed near the royal bed, and when was no trivial matter. Access was tightly controlled, reflecting the hierarchy of court life. Nobles jockeyed for positions that allowed them to be present during dressing or undressing, not because they cared about the monarch's slippers, but because it placed them in the royal orbit. In England, the groom of the stool held one of the most intimate and powerful positions. This person attended the king's bodily needs, helped with bathing and dressing, and often became a trusted confidant. In France, similar positions, valet de chambre, premier gentilhomme de la chambre, acted as gatekeepers to the king's person. These roles blurred lines between service and strategy. To touch the king's body was to be touched by his authority. The queen's chamber, a space of visibility. Queens had their own versions of these rituals. The queen's bedchamber was both a domestic space and a site of dynastic importance. Here, the queen gave birth, often in public view. Witnesses were called to ensure the legitimacy of royal heirs. A noblewoman might be present at the queen's side not as a friend, but as an observer for the state. The bedchamber was also a site for political alliances. Ladies-in-waiting, maids of honor, and noble guests formed a tight circle around the queen. These women carried influence and could pass messages, form factions, and sway decisions, all from the edge of the bed. Even in the act of sleeping, the queen was never truly alone. Bedrooms during travel, portable power. When the monarch traveled, so did the court, and with it the bedroom. Royal beds were designed to be dismantled and reassembled. They were packed onto carts, along with tapestries, carpets, and canopies. Even in a temporary hunting lodge or battlefield tent, the king's bed was reconstructed not just for comfort, but to reassert presence and authority. This bed was more than furniture. It was a mobile throne. Attendants set it up with the same ceremony, draping it with embroidered hangings, placing candles and incense as they would in the palace. The illusion of continuity was preserved. The king might be in the countryside, but his bed still announced his status. Intimacy under surveillance. For all their trappings, royal beds were not sanctuaries. Monarchs rarely experienced true solitude. Spouses, attendants, guards, pages, someone was always nearby. Even moments of intimacy were monitored. Affairs, pregnancies, illnesses, all were matters of state interest. Privacy was limited. Secrecy nearly impossible. This constant observation shaped royal behavior. Kings and queens performed even in private. They learned to sleep lightly, to speak cautiously, to control their expressions. They could close the curtains, but never the eyes of the court. So the next time you picture a royal in repose, remember that bed so rich with embroidery and silk, that room so still and warm with firelight, was not a refuge. It was a court in miniature, and everyone was watching. What does it mean when even sleep is a stage? The royal bedchamber was never just a place for quiet slumber. It was a stage, a witness, and at times a battlefield not of weapons, but of dynasties, fertility, and legitimacy. In this section, we descend deeper into the symbolic and practical uses of the royal bed. We'll see how the act of lying down, waking up, or giving birth became part of political theater. The royal bed was not simply about rest, it was where monarchs secured heirs, sealed alliances, and guarded the lineage of empires. Because in a world where bloodlines were everything, what happened in a royal bed could change history. Birth as a public event. Perhaps nowhere was the political nature of the royal bedchamber more evident than in childbirth. For queens, pregnancy was a public matter. It was announced, tracked, and watched. The culmination, the birth, occurred not in private, but in a semi-public ceremony, often within the queen's own bedchamber. In France, England, and Spain, queens gave birth in rooms specially prepared for the occasion. These rooms were sealed off, darkened, and filled with women, midwives, noble witnesses, and ladies-in-waiting. No men were permitted unless summoned. And yet, despite the heavy curtains and hushed atmosphere, the audience was real. Why? Because the legitimacy of an heir had to be witnessed. The fear of substitution, of switching an infant for one not of royal blood, was strong. Witnesses observed not only the queen's labor, but the baby's emergence, to ensure it truly came from the queen's body. In 1600, when Marie de Medici gave birth to the future King Louis XIII of France, dozens of people were in the room. Such presence wasn't for comfort, it was for certainty. The royal bed in this moment became not a place of privacy, but a theater of fertility. Beds as instruments of succession. The need for heirs was not just personal, it was national. Without a clear line of succession, kingdoms descended into crisis. Wars of inheritance, civil unrest, foreign invasions, all of these could follow a disputed royal birth. Thus, the bed where the heir was conceived and later born became almost sacred. Its location was noted. Its linens were sometimes preserved. In some cases, the bed itself became a relic, passed down as a symbol of dynastic continuity. In England, the Tudor dynasty placed tremendous emphasis on the bedchamber's legitimacy. When Queen Jane Seymour gave birth to Prince Edward in 1537, the long-awaited male heir to Henry VIII, it occurred in a heavily guarded room. The boy's birth was celebrated throughout the kingdom. But Jane died shortly after, and her bed, once a sight of joy, became a symbol of royal sacrifice. These events echoed across centuries. Anne of Austria gave birth to Louis XIV after 23 years of childlessness. Catherine of Aragon, first wife of Henry VIII, endured multiple stillbirths, events that transformed the course of English religion and monarchy. Marie Antoinette gave birth in front of a crowd, leading to changes in future birthing customs. Each time, the bed was at the center not only of life, but of political consequence. Illness, dying, and the final audience. Just as the royal bed marked the beginning of life, it also marked the end. Monarchs rarely died alone. Their final days were often spent in their bedchamber, surrounded by physicians, clergy, family members, and key advisors. These deathbeds were choreographed with care. Why? Because a royal death was not just a personal loss, it was a transition of power. In their final hours, monarchs gave blessings, issued decrees, confirmed succession plans, or made last-minute appeals to God. These words, often spoken from a canopied bed, carried enormous weight. The room was typically filled with incense, candles, and religious icons. Courtiers recorded final words, gestures, even facial expressions, anything that could be used to shape the narrative of the king's life and death. When King Edward VI of England lay dying at the age of 15, his Protestant advisors crowded his bedchamber to ensure he named Lady Jane Grey as successor, bypassing his Catholic sister Mary. That deathbed decision, made from a position of physical weakness, triggered 9 days of political chaos. In death, the royal bed became a throne of final authority. Sleeping with purpose, political marriages and bedding ceremonies. Royal marriages were never only about affection. They were alliances designed to bind nations, settle debts, or prevent wars. In consummation, the act of sleeping together was not assumed. It had to be proven. Enter the bedding ceremony. After a royal wedding, it was customary for nobles, clergy, and courtiers to escort the newlyweds to bed. They often watched the couple undress to some degree, blessed the bed, observed them lying down together, occasionally stayed in the room briefly afterward. Though the act itself was private, its prelude was public. This bizarre tradition served one purpose: to confirm that the marriage was valid and that children born from it would be legitimate heirs. In some cases, sheets were inspected the next morning for signs of consummation. This applied pressure on the couple, and especially the woman, to perform not just affection, but fertility. When Henry IV of France married Marie de Medici, the court demanded that the couple be put to bed under observation. Similarly, in Tudor England, bedding ceremonies were conducted with solemnity and political precision. The royal bed here wasn't just a bed, it was a chamber of proof. Control of access, gatekeepers of the chamber. We've mentioned before that proximity to the bed meant power, but it's worth revisiting how tightly controlled this access truly was. The groom of the stool, the first lady of the bedchamber, the valet de chambre, these were not just servants. They were filters, deciding who got to speak to the monarch privately. A whispered word at the bedside might outweigh hours of argument in council. These attendants had access to the monarch's most vulnerable moments, unfiltered thoughts and moods, personal preferences, illnesses, and habits. As a result, they could influence appointments, relay petitions, and shape royal opinion. In some courts, jealousies and rivalries arose over who had control of the chamber. It was not uncommon for intrigues to begin at the bedroom door. Plots formed, rumors spread, alliances sealed, all through the politics of access. The royal bedroom was never unguarded, but those who guarded it held a quiet kind of rule. So when we imagine royal bedrooms, silken sheets, hushed voices, glowing hearths, we must also imagine the scribes waiting to write down a final decree, the midwives preparing to swear before the court, the servants arranging pillows for a deathbed audience, the courtiers jostling for a place behind the curtain. Because even in sleep, a crown was heavy. And behind the velvet drapes, the wheels of power never stopped turning. The royal bedchamber was the stage of beginnings and endings, of birth, of sleep, of death. But even as monarchs faded into history, their bedrooms remained, sometimes physically, sometimes in ritual, and always in memory. In this final section, we trace the afterlife of the royal bedroom. We'll explore how these once intimate spaces were transformed into political relics, how rituals outlived the royals who practiced them, and how the royal bed continues to whisper of power, even in silence. Because when a monarch dies, the room does not forget. Beds that became shrines. In many cases, the beds where kings and queens died were not dismantled, they were preserved. Some were kept as relics, symbols of a ruler's final moment. Others were turned into monuments, enshrined within chapels or private museums. The bed became a kind of reliquary, no longer touched but revered. When King Henry VII died in 1509, his bed was carefully maintained at Richmond Palace until the court moved. His successor, Henry VIII, inherited not only the throne but the furniture. In time, even the memory of that bed became part of the dynasty's story, the bed of the first Tudor king. Similarly, Marie Antoinette's bedroom in Versailles remains frozen in time, a glimpse into the final decades of the ancient regime. Visitors still file past the ornate canopy, the painted ceiling, the delicate curtains. Though she died by guillotine, her bed remains a museum piece, cloaked in tragic glamour. These preserved rooms speak to an enduring fascination, the space where power once laid down its head. The rituals that outlived the royals. Even as monarchies modernized, many of the rituals of the bedchamber persisted long after their political necessity faded. In England, the gentlemen of the bedchamber and ladies of the bedchamber remained official positions well into the 19th century. Their duties became symbolic, even ceremonial, but their names and titles retained the language of intimacy. The state bedchamber, no longer used for sleeping, became part of palace tour. Rooms once guarded by pages and perfumed with burning herbs were now open to the public. Beds once ringed by nobles were surrounded by velvet ropes. And yet, even in these altered forms, the rituals lingered. When Queen Elizabeth II passed away in 2022, the royal household followed centuries-old protocols, including watch guards, family vigils, and a carefully staged final rest. No longer performed in the bedchamber itself, these ceremonies still echoed the age when every waking and sleeping moment was political. Reimagining royal sleep in literature and art. The royal bedchamber lives on not only in palaces, but in art, film, and literature. Historical dramas recreate it with lavish care. The bed, the canopy, the muted candlelight. Novels imagine secret conversations whispered behind closed doors, conspiracies hatched in the darkness, alliances sealed in the warmth of velvet sheets. Shakespeare understood this. In Henry IV, the dying king lies in bed while his heir enters the chamber, believing him already dead. The scene is intimate and charged, showing the intertwining of personal and political legacies. Painters too found inspiration in the royal bed. Deathbed portraits of monarchs, bathed in sacred light. Marriage scenes, filled with symbolism of fertility and dynasty. Coronation bedrooms, with their ritualized decoration. These depictions shaped public imagination. They reinforced the idea that sleeping and ruling were not separate acts, but deeply intertwined. The private bedroom as a modern invention. With the rise of constitutional monarchies and the decline of absolutism, the royal bedroom changed. Monarchs no longer needed to perform rising and sleeping before courtiers. The bed became a personal space again. Queen Victoria famously rejected the spectacle of the lever and coucher. Her bedroom at Osborne House was private, simple, and suited for domestic life. Her bed was not a throne, but a place of rest. And yet, even in its simplicity, the royal bed remained symbolic. It was there that Victoria died in 1901, surrounded by family, attended by physicians, and documented by the press. Today, British monarchs maintain both a private bed and a state bed used for ceremonies or photographed to convey tradition. Other European royal families maintain similar practices. While these beds may no longer hold daily political weight, they still serve as reminders of continuity. The bed as memory. What remains, then, of these centuries of sleeping in the spotlight? Perhaps it's the idea that the bed normally, the most private of places, can be transformed into a space of immense power. That decisions shaping nations were made not just in councils and courts, but between the sheets, at the edge of sleep, or in the haze of waking. And even though modern monarchs may enjoy real privacy, the legacy of the royal bed endures, not because of its softness or size, but because of its symbolism. The bed is where kings died, queens gave birth, marriages were proved, heirs were conceived, alliances were whispered, Legacies were sealed. In the end, a royal bedroom was never about sleep. It was about control. And even now, long after the courtiers have left and the candles have burned low, the room remembers. The bed remembers. So the next time you pass by a preserved royal chamber or see one recreated on screen, ask yourself, is anyone truly alone in a royal bed? Story 6. The bed as a fortress, privacy, curtains, and canopies. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine lying in bed. Imagine the sense of solitude, the soft spread of linen beneath you, the gentle hush of night. Now imagine waking in the pitch black to the feeling of eyes on you because in the Middle Ages, you were almost never truly alone. In castles, inns, cottages, monasteries, beds weren't only for sleeping, they were for hiding. Welcome to the world of enclosed beds, canopied sleeping platforms, and curtain-draped cocoons, the private fortresses of a deeply public age. In this story, we explore how medieval people created privacy and protection where none was built in. We'll examine the practical, psychological, and even spiritual roles of curtains and canopies. Because for centuries, if you wanted warmth, modesty, or peace, you didn't need a room. You needed a box to sleep in. The problem of open space. To understand the rise of enclosed beds, we must remember that privacy was a rare commodity in the medieval world. Most people, especially in rural or lower-class settings, lived, worked, ate, and slept in the same space. A peasant family's home might have one room. An inn might pack multiple travelers into a single hall. Even in castles, the noble family slept near their retainers. Bedrooms were not common. Instead, people created the illusion of privacy using cloth, wood, and habit. Thus, the bed became a room within a room. The box bed, wood and wool against the world. One of the most iconic expressions of sleeping privacy was the box bed, a wooden, built-in sleeping space with sliding doors or shutters, common in Northern Europe from the late Middle Ages through the 19th century. These beds were essentially wooden cabinets, part bunk, part wardrobe, usually built into the wall of a peasant or lower-class home. Inside was a straw or wool mattress, a few blankets, and the sleeper curled up in the dark. Box beds served multiple purposes. Insulation, wood trapped body heat in cold climates. Security, doors could be latched, keeping out animals or nosy neighbors. Modesty, allowed married couples or older children to separate themselves from communal space. In Brittany, Scotland, and parts of the Low Countries, these beds were standard. Families would store valuables inside during the day and climb in at night like entering a closet. They weren't always comfortable, they were cramped. Air circulation was poor, but they offered something invaluable, a boundary. Curtains, the fabric of privacy. For those who couldn't afford box beds, or for nobles who wanted flexibility, the next best thing was bed curtains. Curtains surrounded most four-poster beds in noble homes. Hung from wooden rails or iron rods, they formed a soft chamber around the sleeper. Why were these so essential? Warmth, curtains trapped body heat, especially important in large stone rooms. Darkness, they blocked light from candles or hearths. Modesty, important in rooms with servants, children, or guests. Symbolism, the richer and more layered the curtains, the more prestigious the bed. These curtains were made from wool, linen, or velvet, depending on status. They were sometimes embroidered with family crests or religious symbols, both decoration and protection. Sleeping with the curtains drawn became an intimate ritual. It was one of the few acts in daily life where a person could choose isolation. The canopy, overhead authority. Above the curtains sat the canopy, originally a functional element, later a symbol of power. In early medieval homes, canopies were sometimes hung from ceilings or rafters to catch falling debris, such as soot, dust, or insects. As beds became more ornate, These overhead hangings evolved into wooden or fabric structures supported by bedposts. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the canopy had become a statement of rank. Kings and nobles slept beneath elaborate carved structures, draped with dyed and embroidered fabric. The canopy became part of visual heraldry, declaring authority even in sleep. To lie beneath a canopy was to claim space. Even when asleep, the nobleman was visibly important. Beds within rooms within worlds. As homes grew more complex, so did sleeping arrangements. By the late Middle Ages, wealthy homes had multiple rooms, and the bedchamber became a private retreat. Yet, the tradition of curtains and canopies persisted. Even with walls, people still built inner walls of cloth. Why? Because the feeling of enclosure was comforting. The space within the curtains was yours alone, safe, dark, warm. In monastic settings, this sense of separation took on spiritual significance. Monks slept in dormitories but used wooden partitions or curtains to create solitude, reflecting the belief that prayer and contemplation required withdrawal from the world. In convents, nuns sometimes slept in enclosed cells or curtained beds, miniature cloisters within the larger religious order. The social meaning of the bed. A curtained bed wasn't just a personal comfort, it was a social statement. When guests visited, their beds were carefully arranged with curtains. To offer someone a sleeping space without curtains was considered inhospitable. Conversely, to invite someone behind your own bed curtains, whether friend, lover, or spouse, was an intimate act, not necessarily sexual but always personal. Within this space, secrets were shared, illnesses were tended, dreams were whispered, deaths were watched. The bed became the center of emotional life, walled off from the chaos beyond. So why all the fuss about hiding the bed? Because in a world of noise, cold, and company, even a thin layer of cloth could feel like a fortress. And when the fire burned low, the castle fell silent, and the stone walls breathed cold. You pulled the curtains closed not just to stay warm, but to say, "This space is mine." By now, it's clear that the medieval and early modern bed was much more than a surface for sleep. In a time when most people lived in open, communal spaces without doors, without silence, without solitude, the bed became something more. A place to withdraw, to enclose, to contain the self. In this section, we explore how beds became architecture, how they were designed to serve not just comfort but identity, ritual, and protection. We look at how canopies and curtains evolved into an entire language of space, and how people rich and poor alike used these makeshift walls to manage the unmanageable: light, noise, smell, fear, and other people. Because in a world without privacy, the enclosed bed became a room of your own, even if it was only a few feet wide. The evolution of the four-poster bed. The four-poster bed, that familiar image of four tall columns supporting a fabric canopy, did not appear overnight. Its origins lie in practicality, but it developed into a symbol of social and architectural innovation. In early medieval homes, most beds were simple platforms or mattresses on the floor or on wooden frames. But by the 13th and 14th centuries, wealthier households began to elevate the bed, literally and socially. What prompted this? Cold. Raising the bed helped avoid damp floors and allowed air to circulate beneath, reducing mildew and rot. Status. Elevation conveyed importance. What was higher was nobler. Insulation. Posts allowed heavy fabrics to be hung, creating warmth. Symbolism. The four-poster resembled a canopied throne, projecting power even in sleep. Initially, canopies were suspended from hooks in the ceiling, but this required solid overhead beams. In buildings where this wasn't possible, posts provided the needed support. Thus, the freestanding bed with integral canopy emerged both practical and mobile. By the 15th century, The four-poster had become standard in noble and wealthy households across Europe. Layers of fabric, layers of purpose. Bed curtains were not all the same. Like a set of nesting dolls, they were layered according to use. Outer curtains made of thick wool or velvet, often richly dyed. These were for warmth and status. Inner curtains of lighter fabrics, often linen or finer weaves. These were for comfort and airflow. Valance, a horizontal fabric that ran around the top of the bed frame, sometimes fringed. It completed the visual enclosure. Headcloth and footcloth hung at either end of the bed, creating a tunnel-like space inside. These layers trapped heat, muffled sound, and filtered light. They also created a barrier between the sleeper and the world, not just physically but emotionally, even psychologically. To draw the curtains was to declare, "I am not available," or perhaps "I am vulnerable, approach with care." Beds as theaters of ceremony. In royal and noble homes, the enclosed bed became a stage not just for rest, but for ritual. We've seen how monarchs received courtiers in their bedrooms, but even minor nobles used bedchambers as spaces of public performance. A guest might be received while the host remained in bed, semi-cloaked in drapes, offering symbolic hospitality from a place of intimacy. A sick noble might hold court from bed, surrounded by family and advisors, a dying but still commanding presence. A newborn might be introduced to the household by being presented from within the mother's curtained bed, the child emerging from the fabric of lineage itself. In all of these, the bed's curtains were drawn and opened like the curtain of a stage, revealing, concealing, controlling the scene. Bed curtains engendered space. For medieval and early modern women, the enclosed bed held special significance. Most women had little control over space, especially in noble households, where movement, behavior, and companionship were tightly managed. But the bed, surrounded by curtains, offered a degree of autonomy. A pregnant woman might retreat to her bed for confinement, a traditional practice of withdrawal before childbirth. After giving birth, she might remain in bed for weeks, visited by women only, surrounded by herbs, icons, and whispered prayers. During illness or menstruation, women were encouraged or expected to remain behind curtains, both to rest and to remain out of public sight. Within the curtain bed, women created community, talking, nursing, laughing, grieving. For many, it was the only space they controlled, however temporarily. Curtains became a form of social boundary, where roles shifted. Inside the enclosure, a maid could be a confidant, a nurse a guide, a visitor a witness to secrets unspoken elsewhere. The sounds and smells of the enclosed bed. We often think of curtains as visual barriers, but they served sensory purposes too. Sound, thick curtains muffled ambient noise, the clatter of servants, barking dogs, the wind through unglazed windows. Inside the bed, sound was softened. Conversations could be held in low voices, secrets kept within. Smell, curtains helped retain pleasant scents or, at times, unpleasant ones. Herbal sachets were often sewn into bed hangings, lavender for calm, rosemary for cleansing, rue or mint for warding off pests. In a smoky world with few baths, beds were some of the cleanest feeling places available. Light, candles might burn nearby, but within the enclosure, their light was dimmed. Some beds had bed candles, small holders fixed inside the curtains, with reflectors to prevent fire. Even so, many people slept in darkness or by the red glow of coals. The bed was a sensorial sanctuary, and the curtains were its skin. Hidden within and hidden from. In rare cases, curtains served more dramatic purposes. They concealed not just sleepers, but plots. In court intrigues, secret meetings sometimes occurred behind bed hangings. In literature and legend, murders were committed under the cover of curtains. Bed enclosures were used to hide people, lovers, children, even rebels fleeing discovery. In Shakespeare's Hamlet, Polonius hides behind a curtain in the queen's chamber, only to be killed. The curtain is more than a prop, it's a symbol of hidden truth, private danger. Even outside of fiction, the curtain was never just cloth, it was possibility. So what happens when you draw a curtain around a bed? You create a chamber. You define a boundary. You declare, for now this space is mine. And whether you are a queen in confinement or a child in a box bed in rural France, you learn to treasure those brief hours of enclosure because outside the curtain, the world never really stops. But behind it, you might just find a moment's peace. Curtains once stood between the individual and the world, between cold and warmth, noise and silence, visibility and invisibility. But no curtain stays drawn forever. In this final section, we explore the slow unraveling of the enclosed bed and the dawn of the modern bedroom. We'll follow the fatting of box beds and heavy canopies, the redefinition of privacy, and how changing attitudes toward sleep, space, and selfhood reshaped not only where people rested, but who they thought they were while resting. Because as walls rose around bedrooms and curtains fell away from beds, something subtle but profound occurred. Privacy stopped being a fabric. It became a room. The waning of the box bed and the rise of architecture. From the late 17th century onward, social and architectural shifts began to reshape how Europeans thought about domestic space. Middle-class homes grew larger. Rather than one room shared by a whole household, families now had multiple chambers, increasingly separated by function: parlor, kitchen, study, and importantly, bedroom. With this, the need for enclosed or curtained beds decreased. After all, the cold could be addressed by fireplaces and later, stoves. Noise was reduced by solid doors and dedicated sleeping quarters. Privacy no longer had to be constructed with fabric, it was built in. Thus, the box bed, once the warmest, most secure place in a peasant cottage, began to disappear. In some regions, notably in rural Scotland and Brittany, it persisted into the 19th century, but it was now seen as old-fashioned, even primitive. The modern bed, open, wide, and uncurtained, was a symbol of modernity and cleanliness, changing ideas of privacy and the self. This shift was not just about architecture, it was cultural. In earlier centuries, people had shared their sleeping spaces without embarrassment. Children, adults, even travelers might share a mattress, a bench, a floor. Modesty was spatial, not moral. But with Enlightenment ideals and the rise of individualism came new ideas about the self. Solitude was no longer a suspicion, it was a virtue. Bedrooms became sanctuaries, and sleeping alone, or with only one spouse, became a moral norm. Curtains, once a sign of prestige and necessity, came to be seen as unhygienic, fussy, and symbolically regressive. By the 18th and 19th centuries, doctors and reformers warned against heavy bed drapery. Enclosed beds were thought to trap foul air. The emphasis shifted to clean linens, airy rooms, open beds, often with iron frames to discourage pests. Curtains were removed not just from beds but often from windows as well, to allow in sunlight and fresh air. What once offered comfort now signaled decay. The bed in a room of its own. By the Victorian period, the bedroom had firmly emerged as a distinct architectural and emotional space. Bedrooms were no longer corners of shared rooms or curtained sections of a hall. They were assigned, decorated, and furnished specifically for sleep. Wealthy homes had separate bedrooms for each family member, and often for guests and staff. This architectural shift brought with it a profound psychological one. Sleep became private, regulated, tied to routine and morality. The bed no longer needed curtains to create enclosure. It had walls. It had a door with a lock. And yet some echoes remained. Echoes in furniture and language. Though the curtain fell on most four-poster beds, their memory lingers. Even today, certain furniture preserves the shape of enclosure. The headboard and footboard of many modern beds still resemble the frames of old box beds. Some beds have canopy-like structures, even if the drapes are absent. Cribs and toddler beds mimic the safety and boundary of enclosed spaces. Our language, too, remembers. Draw the curtains still means to create privacy. Behind closed doors implies secrecy, even if no curtains are involved. Sleeping like royalty often evokes a canopied bed even if today's royalty prefer something much simpler. These are ghosts of the curtain, not physical fabric, but mental habit. Nostalgia, preservation, and re-enclosure. In the 20th and 21st centuries, we see flickers of nostalgia for enclosure. Historical reenactments and museums preserve box beds, state beds, and curtained frames. Designers revive four-poster beds in romantic or heritage interiors. People hungering for rest in a noisy world now seek sleep pods, blackout tents, and enclosed hotel beds, new technologies that mimic old instincts. Even modern sleep science has begun to recognize what medieval people knew: that enclosure can help the mind rest. It creates safety. It defines edges. It says, here, for now, the world stops. In some ways, we never stopped drawing the curtain. We just changed the material. So what did we lose when the curtain fell? We lost the ritual of enclosure, the act of separating self from world with the simple pull of a drape. We lost the symbolic nest, the soft womb of privacy inside a hard, cold world. We gained architecture, but perhaps lost a kind of intimacy with space. Still, the memory lingers. And sometimes, when we close our eyes and pull the blankets over our heads, we aren't just seeking warmth. We're reaching instinctively for the curtain.